Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to Episode 12 of Everything Compliance, the Summer Haze Edition. The dog days of summer are on the horizon, and four of the top commentators in compliance are back together for another episode of Everything Compliance. Matt Kelly opens with a discussion about the revisions to the COSO ERM Framework, which were based on comments by the practitioners. Matt considers the integration of the COSO ERM Framework into functional business units, moving to operationalize ERM in organizations, and then we consider how the ERM Framework differs yet is complementary to the COSO Internal Controls Framework. Jonathan Armstrong reviews the recently released information that 8 companies are currently under investigation by the SFO and whether the SFO is out of control. He then takes a dive into some of the ancillary issues around the Unioil investigation, considering the issues which have arisen in the Wood-AMEC Group merger, where both parties are under SFO investigation. He discusses what you might consider as a merger candidate in this situation. Finally, Armstrong handicaps the upcoming UK election and what it might mean for compliance. Jay Rosen brings his Mr. Monitorship hat and his former Mr. Translation set of eyes to the question of operationalizing your compliance program. He considers how the compliance function can work with other corporate functions to embed compliance into the fabric of an organization, making compliance a competitive advantage. And finally, Mike Volkov examines the FinCEN enforcement action involving Thomas Hadar, the former CCO at MoneyGram. Mike considers the implications for CCOs and whether the case even matters for CCOs. The episode comes in at just around an hour. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Everything Compliance. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you back for another episode of Everything Compliance, the top compliance commentator roundtable podcast around. Our Everything Compliance panel is Matt Kelly, founder of Radical Compliance; Mike Volkov, founder of the Volkov Law Group; Jonathan Armstrong, partner at Cordery Compliance; and Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors. So, gentlemen, we have had quite an interesting couple of weeks in the world, but I thought we might focus on the compliance world since we last got together. And Matt, you've been looking at, thinking about, and frankly, writing some very interesting things about the COSO framework. You and I had the chance to visit with that a little bit earlier this week, but I was wondering if you could maybe talk about the COSO ERM framework and how that ties into and is complementary to either the COSO Internal Controls Framework, a general compliance program, or in a direction that maybe I hadn't thought of. So take it away, Matt.
Yeah, sure. It's great to be back here, Tom. Hello, everybody. So, yes, for compliance, audit, and risk executives, we have a big deal coming along, probably within the next month or so, by certainly, I think, mid-July. We will have a final new framework from COSO for enterprise risk management. This has been in the works for, I want to say, the better part of 2 years, possibly 3. And this is going to, I think, over time, become a very useful tool for a lot of people in a lot of large enterprises. So conceptually, the ERM framework from COSO will be kind of sort of similar to what companies already generally do with COSO's framework for internal controls. The internal control framework really is the go-to standard to help manage your Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. This ERM framework, this is going to be able to be used, in theory, much more widely for a whole lot of other bigger risks that your board is probably, frankly, more interested in. We all love good SOX compliance risks, but the ERM framework is going to be designed to handle more strategic risks, operational, financial, and regulatory risks too. What's it going to be? So like I said, it's very similar to the COSO internal control framework in its structure. It's going to have 5 basic components, and they will be supported by 20 underlying principles. And it's really intended to help a company focus more rigorously on risk management and risk awareness throughout the whole organization. And what they really want to get away from is the idea that risk management is a phase that you go through, or it's a department that somebody else runs and I don't have to worry about it. Me here, say in HR or the IT department or the sales department, I do my thing. I want to do it. Then the risk department risks manages, tells me what I can do, what I can't, and then I try and do it anyways. So there'll be a lot of how to be much more disciplined throughout the whole organization. I could give one easy example here is one thing the COSO framework wants to help companies do is focus on their objectives and setting objectives much more clearly. And then once you have your objective in mind, you kind of reverse engineer, well, what are our risks to not hitting those objectives? And what do we have to do to avoid those risks? It's a little bit of a different approach than a lot of companies. Frankly, they think more like, what are the risks that we want to avoid? Well, we don't want an FCPA violation. We don't want a bad integration after a big merger deal. We don't want foreign currency exposure catching us unawares. So let's make sure that doesn't happen. Well, that's really focusing on what you're not doing rather than what do you want to do? Keep your eye on that ball. Now, what might get in the way of doing that, including things like ethical misconduct, regulatory infractions, whatnot, they might get in the way. How do we make sure that they don't block us from our objectives, but where are we keeping our eye on the ball? So it's a lot of that sort of stuff. I'll give one final example of what I think this framework could do. It's a very good observation from an audit executive I know. He's at a very acquisitive company that a couple of years ago essentially did a huge deal, doubled in size by employee base, by geographic reach, and by product line. This was a big deal when they did it, and they had to integrate a lot of things. And frankly, this audit executive said, look, the integration was a bit rocky, and we know we're going to acquire more companies in the future. Now I'll be able to go to my board with this framework and say, here's how we think in a more disciplined way to make sure that we don't have rocky integrations in the future, that everybody who wants to do something new will be able to sort of game out what the risks are of doing that poorly and make sure that we don't have those mistakes. I could go on, but really that's what it's trying to do. And I think audit executives, risk executives, they'll probably flock to this framework first. But over time, I think a whole lot of other people, including your board, who will want to bake this into every operation you have at your enterprise, and compliance officers, you're all going to wind up thinking about this sort of stuff a whole lot more. It's a very good document to have out there. So that's what I got for you.
Matt, do you see this as complementary to the internal controls framework, or is this something that you would advocate the compliance professional really take on this framework first in lieu of the 2013 internal controls update?
No, I wouldn't advocate that. I think it is better to say that this is a bigger, broader approach to the same sort of issues you grapple with internal controls. That's very much looking at where are the weak spots in our financial reporting processes, how do we seal those up, and it gets very granular about the types of weakness you might have. So it's the same sort of approach as look at what are your weaknesses and how do you seal them up, but it's much more for everything you might do. And frankly, there is the reality that a lot of companies are already using the internal control framework because SOX compliance has been something you've been dealing with for a long time. And the 2013 framework is very good for that. I don't think people are going to abandon that so much as they're going to start saying, well, how do we scale up these ideas to the other operations the company has? I think boards in particular are going to see if they could use that for strategic risks, because companies still make a lot of strategic mistakes, or they don't achieve the the benefits of whatever they were hoping for. Like my friend with the merger that was, eventually it went through and company was integrated, but it was rocky and it took them longer and probably, I suspect, cost more than they were expecting. So how do you really have a more rigorous approach to things you do and the risks around them? That's what this framework's looking for.
So would it be fair to characterize this as an attempt to operationalize risk into the individual business corporate disciplines, moving it down so that everyone's thinking about it both on a tactical and strategic level?
Yes, I think so. That's exactly what the COSO people want to do. And I think one small but telling gesture that they've made is their original framework had a graphic that featured, on the left were your principles and values and your mission, and on the right was the enhanced performance. And to get from left to right, you went through this rainbow of what the COSO ERM framework was proposing. And then somewhere over the rainbow, you had this enhanced performance and life was great. Well, that was the original graphic idea. And they realized that was a mistake because it conveys this idea that risk management is something you go through and then you get on with your daily life. And that's not what daily life actually looks like. Risks are always there. You're always managing them. You have no final triumph over risks and then everything is great. So they've scrapped that rainbow idea for, I don't know what it will look like, but they have described it as a DNA-like structure. So I'm guessing that's some sort of weird double helix thing that I last saw in 10th grade biology class. But, your journey through your corporate operations, you're embedding risk awareness and risk management principles into everything everybody does, from HR to IT to compliance to finance to sales and everything else. Now, what is that really going to look like? That's really going to depend on your company and how you think about this framework. But like we said, it's coming out probably in another 4 to 6 weeks, and we'll have a much better sense of things then.
Jay or Jonathan, any questions for Matt?
Not from me. Sounds an interesting approach.
Well, Jonathan, go ahead, Jay.
No, I said I'm good to go, so continue forward.
Well, Jonathan, we have had some, I thought, pretty interesting developments out of the United Kingdom outside of the election and outside of Brexit, where the two large companies, engineering companies, the Wood Group and AMEC, were considering or are, I think, attempting to merge. And it turns out they are both under investigation from the Serious Fraud Office around Unioil. I was wondering if you might unpack that for us and tell us about, or at least perhaps give us some guidance on what companies can do in the M&A context around this issue of if your partner or your acquirer even may be under investigation. What does it all mean from your perspective?
Yeah, happy to. There's been a lot of activity in the Unioil case at the moment, and it's probably fair both to the SFO and to those accused to say not too much about that, except that some of the individuals concerned and some of the corporations concerned brought judicial review proceedings against the SFO recently, which they lost and which, as a result, the SFO won. So that relates to some of the cooperation activity that the SFO have had with the Monaco authorities. And at the same time, the SFO have said little, but something about the fact that some connected parties are under investigation as well, including Petrofac. But the disclosures relating to both AMEC Foster Wheeler and John Wood, and for full disclosure, back in the day, 40 years or so ago, my father worked for Foster Wheeler. But those allegations seem to be connected to the Unioil investigation, and that's something that both of the corporations concerned have made public rather than the SFO. it's fair to say that Unioil denies wrongdoing, and it's fair to say that at this stage, Amec Foster Wheeler and Wood Group do as well. Amec Foster Wheeler are the target company. They say that they have given some documents to the SFO, and Wood Group, the acquirer, say that they were part of a joint venture which paid Unioil some money, but that they don't consider that to have been a bribe. And I think in many respects, that's the sort of lead into the approach, really. As many of you will know, under the UK Bribery Act, a company can be liable for its joint venture partners, and it also has an obligation to stamp out bribery. There's a failure to prevent provision in the legislation. And when we get to merger and an acquisition activity, it's slightly disappointing in that there is a whole principle of the MOJ guidance that accompanies the Bribery Act that talks about due diligence, but most of that talks about due diligence in agents and sales channel and things like that. Now, to backtrack slightly, the MOJ guidance only deals with these failure to prevent provisions, and the MOJ isn't the same as the DOJ in the US. The MOJ was the government department that was responsible for putting the Bribery Act on the statute book. It has no role to play in enforcement. So the Serious Fraud Office doesn't have to follow the MOJ guidance, but it's likely to take it into account when assessing whether a company's done the right thing or not. But Principle 4.4 says that organizations need to take special care when entering into some business relationships. It says that they may need to undertake a thorough due diligence and risk mitigation prior to entering into any commitments. And it says a relationship that carries particularly important due diligence implications is a merger of commercial organizations or an acquisition of one by another. And in this case, both the target and the acquirer, I think, have acted very properly in disclosing the fact that there is this potential blip, let's call it that, when they're going through this transaction, so that shareholders of both organizations are in a state of knowledge. Whether or not there's any wrongdoing involved, I think it's right that they disclose the fact that this investigation's going on. Unlike the US, though, there's the options as to what either party can do are somewhat limited. So, and maybe we can have a discussion about this, Tom, because I know you'll be more up to date with this than I am. But from my distant perspective, we've always looked at the Halliburton opinion, which I know is somewhat old now, which set out some guidance when one organization is acquiring another of the type of things that it might need to do post-acquisition if it's unable to do them pre-acquisition. And I think Halliburton came from a somewhat peculiar set of circumstances. But there's no similar route in the UK. And the current director of the SFO is famous for saying, I'm a prosecutor, not a regulator. It's not my business to advise companies on what to do. They need to do what they think they need to do, take proper advice, and if they get it wrong, I'll prosecute them. There might, however, be one route that's open, which is a relatively recent route, which might be, if there is wrongdoing, and I'm stressing if, and I'm putting it in capital letters and marking it with red ink, if there is any wrongdoing, then they might want to try and turn the discussions they're having with the Serious Fraud Office into a discussion about a deferred prosecution agreement. And that might be a way to try and crystallize liability, get some certainty, get a clear plan agreed both with the SFO and with the courts, and enable them to move on. And that seems to be a feature of the Standard Bank case, for example, which was the UK's first DPO at the end of of last year. And now, obviously, a DPA, it's like, the old saying, a dog isn't for Christmas. Well, a DPA isn't just for a corporate transaction, and it would require very serious thought before you even try to enter into those negotiations. And of course, under the UK legislation, the corporation can't initiate those discussions. It has to be invited by the SFO to come and sit around the table. But it is a challenging situation. And of course, for all of those organizations involved, the first step has to be proper due diligence and working out exactly what's happened. Just as one final comment, made slightly more challenging by a recent court case, which we oughtn't to go into now, around privilege, but privilege is a moving feast in the UK, and sharing investigation reports with the potential acquirer may not be a good idea. So you may need to think about workarounds in that circumstance to avoid privilege being lost.
That would be a very interesting development, Jonathan, if the parties could, of course, with SFO initiation, sit together and craft out a solution to the specific problem of Unioil that then perhaps could be guidance for the rest of the compliance practitioners, the compliance world. The Halliburton opinion, of course, there's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has a specific provision which allows the government to give an opinion on a specific fact scenario called an opinion release. But under that fact pattern, Halliburton was not able to do, as you correctly noted, sufficient pre-acquisition due diligence. So they were highly compressed post-acquisition to do a very thorough investigation, 30, 60, 90-day time frame for high, medium, and low-risk third-party agents. Share that information with the government, and the government and then remediate as necessary. And the government agreed to, under that fact scenario, not prosecute Halliburton for FCPA violations. So it was unique to that situation with Halliburton, but it was a solution that I heard Chuck DeRoss say when he was just after he left being the head of the FCPA unit. If you can't do it pre-acquisition, you have to compress your timeframes post-acquisition. And that was really the reason for the very robust requirements that Halliburton agreed to. And if both AMEC and Wood could craft or graft, I guess would be the better word, with the SFO and judicial input and oversight of formula to deal with the specific fact situation, it could certainly be very interesting and creative and give us some additional guidance for this issue under the UK Bribery Act.
Yeah, I think so. I think the chances are probably less than 10%, but it would be an interesting thing if it happened.
So there's a rumor, Jonathan, that there's some sort of election coming up in the United Kingdom, and I'm not quite sure how true that rumor is. But I know Matt had really put his political editor hat on, and I think he had some questions for you.
Well, yeah, sure. Jonathan, I just want to know, as our man in London, what is going on with these sudden new polls that Theresa May, the prime minister, she may not have a cakewalk here with the election next week. And I thought she was going to cruise to a huge victory that would mean a clear mandate for whatever she wanted to do, including maybe reforms at the SFO. But now suddenly I see this might be down to the wire or a hung parliament, or I don't know what's going on. So what's going on?
Yeah, it is completely messy. And I do feel at the moment, every time anyone mentions our election, that I ought to hammer another nail into my own forehead, because that seems to be the way that many of our politicians are behaving. I think it is difficult to call. I think one of the difficulties that we get in the UK, and we've talked about it before, is we have these echo chambers. So I was sat next to a guy I didn't know on the train last night who says, absolutely everyone in my social media timeline is saying Corbyn's going to win. Now, that's not what I think from where I'm sitting. But I think the difficulty we have is that the polls can be so radically wrong. I think most people, though, to use a sporting phrase, think that Theresa May has the ability to clutch defeat out of the jaws of victory. It should have been an entire walkover for her, but I think she's taken a number of very serious missteps, perhaps the least serious of which, but let's comment on it since you raised it, is the proposed abolition of the SFO. Now, that's not really a surprise. We know that when Theresa May was Home Secretary and sort of responsible for the SFO, she didn't exactly see eye to eye. But whether that, not seeing eye to eye is sufficient enough to become a manifesto commitment, which is normally reserved for sort of serious promises that people, care about, is, I think, questionable at least, particularly after the SFO has had a rise in morale and something of a victory, you might say, with Rolls-Royce. The other questionable thing about timing actually does get back to Unioil. And again, wrong to go into all of the facts, and we probably haven't got time anyway. But there is a question mark over saying that you have a commitment to abolish the SFO when one of the people involved in that investigation, and I don't say that they've committed any criminal acts or not, but let's just say one of those individuals whose door has been knocked on by the SFO has donated something north of $1 million to Theresa May, in part for this election campaign. And to be honest, Matt, this isn't throwing it back to you, but to be honest, that sort of activity I expect from your administration, but I don't expect from mine.
The only thing I have to say about the British election is I saw this week that at the top of the pop charts now is some parody song calling Theresa May a liar, liar. I listened to it on iTunes. It's a pretty groovy tune, but I'm going to not comment further on British politics.
I think it's banned from the BBC at the moment, that song. And one of the great missteps, of course, was this televised debate. It had been, we don't have the history of televised debates that you do in the US, but it's still, it's only been going for 2 or 3 elections, but it's unheard of, really, for the leader of a major political party not to show up. Then to send somebody who very unfortunately had suffered the loss of her father 48 hours earlier instead because she was less busy wasn't a great idea. And then to authorize or at least not prohibit your social media team from dissing everybody else who did take part and imply that they were cowards when you were the one that didn't show up is, a stream of disasters after disasters. And it's unfortunate, really, that I'm no great fan of David Cameron, but one thing David Cameron was quite good about, I think, as a former marketing man, was looking at consistency of message, making sure that you weren't saying one thing with the right hand side of your mouth and one with the left. And unfortunately, that's a skill that the Theresa May team seem perhaps to have lost.
All right,
Jonathan. This is Mike Volkov here. And
hi, Mike.
What a question for you is what I don't understand is what's the politics of opposing the SFO? What is the problem with the SFO, and why is there one party that wants to merge it into the Ministry of Justice? And what's the hope in doing that? What are they trying to accomplish? And, why have they always been a lightning rod?
Yeah, they're not trying to merge it into the Ministry of Justice. Constitutionally, that's prohibited. So the SFO has to be an independent body. But they are, Theresa May has had this long-standing, love affair, would you call it, with this unification of crime-fighting bodies. And what she wants to do is merge the SFO almost back where it came from. So serious fraud was split off from the existing prosecution system, if you like, to enable there to be a multidisciplinary approach so that it could be lawyers and investigators and accountants working together. And I think, to be neutral about it, Theresa May sort of wants to push the bodies together. And I guess she would say that that will give more energy to lower level financial crimes like money laundering, which can be an indicator of other criminal offences. The other interesting thing from my point of view is that if Corbyn were to become Prime Minister, and that's a big capital, a big capital if, who would then be making the decision? The Home Secretary candidate is somebody called Diane Abbott, who, now I'll slag off the Labour Party in the interest of balance, would make, would make Kermit the Frog look like a genius. So I don't think she's of the intellectual wherewithal to make serious decisions about that. The person who is very, very understanding of the criminal system and who I would rate very highly is Keir Starmer, who's the shadow Brexit minister. But Keir Starmer was the former director of public prosecutions. So if you like, the body that the head of the body that the SFO was split off from. So even if and I reached out to Keir Starmer last night, by the way, just to see what his plans would be were he to be in a position of influence. I don't know that yet. But whatever happens, I think there's an interesting future for the SFO. And the other thing I can tell you for certain, Mike, is we've already seen people jump ship. If I'm in public service in a body that could be abolished in a matter of weeks, and a law firm comes and offers to triple or quadruple my salary, then I'm not hanging around. So the difficulty is even if the SFO remains, it might be that it remains, with half the lawyers that it had a fortnight ago because of the uncertainty that this has all created.
Wow. Interesting.
So let's move on to Jay Rosen. Jay, you are now Mr. Monitors, but you were formerly Mr. Translations. And you've come to the compliance world really from a different place than the other panelists. And I was wondering more from a business perspective. From a business perspective, I wanted to get your thoughts on what the DOJ really put in front of everyone's mind in February with the evaluation of corporate compliance documents, the term operationalization. I know you talked about that a lot when you were Mr. Translations, and you've talked about that some as Mr. Monitors. But I was wondering if you might lead us in a kind of an exploration of what you see, how you see compliance operationalizing into the business, really from your business hat perspective.
Great question, Tom, and hello to everybody. As you point out, majority of you guys are coming at this either from a legal perspective or a journalistic perspective, and I almost stumbled into the FCPA world about 7-8 years ago when I was working for a translation company. And, as I've told the story before, I was trying to look at how I could differentiate myself. And when I heard the foremost beautiful letters in the world, FCPA, the proverbial light bulb went off over my head. And one of the things that we were doing from the translation perspective is helping companies communicate globally with their workforce. And with the new evaluation, it is just such a great tool to bring up areas within your corporation where you can operationalize the compliance function. And generally, the people that I was dealing with from a translation perspective were squarely sitting in the chief compliance officer's role. But one of the things we would see as we would roll out the process, doing the translations, and then after that, sending the translated documents to compliance ambassadors who are in each locale, you started to get the feedback from the different constituencies within that corporation. So whether it was HR, legal, internal audit, the controller's office, you could really tell, depending on which company you were working with, you could have a very good idea about how well entrenched and sophisticated their compliance program was in terms of how many rounds of edits you did and how early in the process the different constituencies were involved. So with some places, you could do a translation in 4 to 6 weeks, but it could take 4 to 6 months to actually roll out an approved version of that document, because you had so many different players who were involved and they really weren't incentivized to get their sign off. So that would be one kind of outlier at the far end of the spectrum. And on the other side, you would have companies that really just jumped on it, that there was a culture of compliance there, and that these folks who were the compliance ambassadors in different countries and different territories, they had done this process before. You could see it was a well-oiled machine. So those are kind of like the two different ends of the spectrum from the translation perspective. As we see it now from the monitoring perspective, you also really need to, take that village to kind of build your program. And each of those, I know we talk about the prongs of the evaluation, but if we want to talk about the prongs of the different internal departments at corporations, as I said before, HR pretty much has a pulse on everything from a personnel perspective. So HR can really be a great ally to give you a heads up if there's a problem or if something isn't working well. So they are good folks to get on your team to become compliance ambassadors. In terms of operationalizing your compliance program, or operationalizing an internal evaluation or an assessment, internal audit really sees how the machinery moves. And as they are out within the corporation, they're a great ally to use to do random testing and to see if programs that have been put in place are actually working that way. So they can give you an early warning side in terms of whether or not there are issues from ethics and compliance, and then to look at the hard numbers when you go through the accounting and the controlling function. You really can see if there's any types of inconsistency on monthly billings or commission statements. So, by using all that information and now actually having a formal tool to use, the evaluation, to look about how different, different groups in your company are, collaborating, it really gives you an opportunity, either both from that language perspective, which was my initial entry into the compliance world, and now working at it from a monitor perspective, either a self-monitoring exercise just to take a check of your organization's health and see how they're doing, or also a monitor that has been prescribed by some regulatory body.
So, Jay, I heard a term this morning listening to a Harvard Business Review podcast, which was revenue generation and revenue extraction. And it was applied to the finance discipline, but it really got me to thinking about those phrases in terms of compliance. I don't think compliance would ever be considered revenue extraction, but certainly revenue enhancement or revenue generation. And I guess what I heard from you was there really are ways for compliance to move towards that model of revenue generation by being a part of the business process at the really the front lines tactical level. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and that always brings up the discussion of silos that you have within the corporation. And when you start to build these bridges within companies, you realize that there are folks out there who may be better handled for doing certain tasks. So in the series that you and Russ Berlin looked at this week, not only did you look at the folks who can be your allies and who can help you be more efficient because they're the subject matter experts and they might have the better access to data, but you also looked at specific obstacles which may prevent people from actually getting on the same page and working forward. And some of those things, are just the KPIs and the key metrics. And if people are not incentivized to do compliance and operationalize compliance, then that might not happen. So part of that is going back and, we've seen this with other companies, taking a look at how senior management is incentivized from an ethics and compliance perspective. So that's one part about kind of breaking down the silos and making it worthwhile for different departments to participate and help operationalize your compliance so it can be a competitive advantage. And, the other part is really people tend to stay in their own little world. So as Russ talked about it, he served a lot of pizza in his days. And this is something that we consistently talk about when your CCO is visiting different plants or visiting different companies, that it's invaluable to get out on the front line and talk to people. But I think that, that idea of pizza has to happen even more as we strive to operationalize these benefits within a corporation. The more and more opportunities that you have to work with folks who are outside your immediate discipline, the better you can take their objective point of view and, really take a look at how things are being done and trying to find a way to get rid of those folks who say, quote, it's always been done that way. So if you can kind of break through, and, I think a lot of it has to do with planning when you go back. And when we talk about, whether you're going to have 3-year horizons or 5-year horizons, but if the proper planning isn't done to really take the different functions and get them working together, then you really cannot hope to achieve very great results. So a lot of it is planning, changing corporate culture, and then, bringing in those subject matter experts who can help more on the revenue generation side. And whether or not there are initial tangible results, I think we all believe that by the operationalizing of ethics and compliance, that companies will eventually get there.
Anyone have any questions for Jay? Okay, on to Mike Volkov. Mike, welcome and greeting us today from hopefully still sunny Sicily.
Beautiful Sicily.
Thank you for that visual. We had a couple of interesting legal issues that I wanted you to maybe lead a discussion around. The first one was you wrote about a FinCEN enforcement action involving Thomas Hayter, a former chief compliance officer at MoneyGram, and you really didn't think it negatively impacted personal liability of CCOs. And then second, we had an oral argument a little bit earlier this year in a former Alstom executive's case, a fellow named Lawrence Hoskins, and he had objected to DOJ, or I guess U.S. government jurisdiction over him. So I was just wondering if what you might think about those two cases.
Well, yep. Let's start first with the MoneyGram chief compliance officer enforcement action. First off, I think it's important to consider that it was a civil enforcement action, not a criminal. It's still the money that he had to pay in this case was a $250,000 civil penalty. But this was after years sort of negotiation and back and forth. And he also has a 3-year bar from serving as a compliance officer at any money transmission business. But I guess, in general, when I see enforcement actions against chief compliance officers, I don't have the same sort of fear and that this is going to, put at risk chief compliance officers, because usually their behavior is so bad that, frankly, I have no problem usually with the enforcement action that occurs. So, I mean, in the MoneyGram case, what to me was interesting, there were 3 sort of sets of facts that got Hayter, and I hate to, first off, he didn't have a good name as a defendant, being called Hayter. But there were sort of 3 sets of facts that got him into trouble. MoneyGram had a serious problem with fraud and agents, who would be involved in committing fraud against individuals and customers, and stealing money, and basically controlling their third parties was just a major problem for them. So and this tells you how old the case this is. In 2006, 2007, MoneyGram's fraud department proposed that they implement a policy for terminating agents and outlets that were at a high risk of fraud. Hayter was given a proposed policy, but he basically failed to act on it because of objections from the sales department. Then in 2007, there were a number of outlets in Canada that the fraud department wanted to cancel because basically a small group of outlets were responsible for approximately 60% of all the fraud occurring in Canada involving MoneyGram during a 6-month period. They also had specific risk characteristics that Hayter and other members of the fraud and compliance department recognized were sort of strong red flags that the outlets were involved in fraud. So, just to show you how bad this was, one operator, for example, ended up pleading guilty to criminal fraud, and as a result of sort of this internal investigation and the company's investigation. So again, Hayter, knowing all this, failed to act with regard to terminating any of these agents or outlets. And again, he responded to the opposition, he claimed there was the opposition from the sales department. Then, look, 2 of those, I guess we could get into a discussion as to, exercising discretion and was this inappropriate or, whatever. But the third allegation against him was that he actually deliberately structured the AML program that MoneyGram eventually put in 2007 and to restrict the analysts' access to critical information that was used to conduct fraud analyses, and restricted their access to information so they couldn't identify individual outlets like they had done in prior times where there was indications of fraud. And as a result of that, they were not able to generate information that would lead to the filing of suspicious activity reports. And he was aware of that and knew what he was doing. And there were numerous entities for which, as a result of this policy that he put in, they did not file SARS or suspicious activity reports for those entities. So, when you combine all of this, it's really hard to defend Hayter's conduct, remembering that it's a civil penalty, not a criminal penalty. The government's burden of proof here is a preponderance of the evidence. And it's not, I really didn't sympathize that much with Hayter's situation. And I do think that when to maintain credibility, and I guess this is my sort of bottom line is, if a chief compliance officer breaks the law, be it criminal or civil, they should be prosecuted. On the other hand, I think we had a New York regulation at one time where they were going to require chief compliance officers to certify as to AML programs and the sufficiency and the reasonableness of the AML program. And then the idea was, well, if it doesn't work out, we'll prosecute the CCO, the chief compliance officer, for false certification. That I had more trouble with. When you're making the chief compliance officer responsible for something that they don't have control over, in other words, access to resources, ability to move people and money and ideas and technology around, I have a problem when it gets to that. But here, where you had an actor's conduct that was pretty blatant, I don't really have any problem with that. So, but I think it's much more controversial. People think there's a chilling effect from these types of prosecutions. But I think that chief compliance officers, just like anybody else, have to become big boys and big girls and, and deal with these kinds of issues and do a good job with it. But I'm curious if anybody else feels differently, but that's sort of my take on that case.
Oh, Mike, this is Matt here, and I do have a comment question, I guess. I agree with you 100% that, when you are as grossly negligent as Hader seems to have been, or if you are complicit in misconduct, like, what do you think is going to happen, people? You should be held liable if that's it. And I saw a study somewhere earlier today that fears about chief compliance officer liability are declining, which I think they should, because I also agree with you that this is a bit overblown. But what caught my eye was that separately this past month in May, the FDIC settled charges against the compliance officer of Banamex USA, which is the U.S. subsidiary of the Mexican subsidiary of a division of Citigroup, if I'm remembering my org chart correctly. But this compliance officer, who was not named, he's been barred from the industry and had to pay a $70,000 fine. I'm not entirely clear on what the case was there, but I was struck that, okay, that does actually seem like two compliance officers in a row in relatively quick succession. I was kind of jolted by that, but I was just curious if anybody knew any of the details about that Banamex case.
I don't know the facts of that case, but, just to pile on to the concern area, I have seen cases at the SEC where, compliance officers are held liable for, I would say facts that are far less strong, far less egregious than like the Hader case. In the FDIC matter in Banamex, I know that it was a pretty egregious case in terms of the level and amount, and people actually thought that Banamex got off very lightly given the conduct. But you have to be careful. I agree with you, because I've seen cases at the SEC that are sort of, you scratch your head a little bit in terms of liability and holding people responsible as a chief compliance officer at an investment bank or whatnot. But it's definitely something to keep keep on top of. But then, then you run into the situation like the Volkswagen chief compliance officer, who was absolutely, sitting in jail in Miami right now, or up in Michigan now, awaiting trial when, they were, active participants in the criminal conspiracy. And nobody questions that, I don't think. But, I think the regulatory enforcement issues they tend to be a lot closer. This one I didn't think was that close, but the FDIC, the SEC, and, we may see some in the CFTC and others that have beefed up their ranks a little bit lately. So it's something to definitely stay on top of.
As just a very brief anecdote, back in 2015, the UK financial regulator fined the Bank of Beirut, and they also fined two individuals, a guy called Anthony Wills, who was the former compliance officer, and Michael Aylin, who was the internal auditor. And I wrote a blog on it when it came out. And I received a call almost immediately afterwards from a guy who said, "I'm Anthony Wills. Do I need a lawyer to speak to you?" And I said, depends what you're going to say. And he said, look, I don't want to say anything other than, can I meet you for coffee and tell you how my life has changed? And it really was a fascinating coffee meeting with him. And to Matt's point, it's not just whether a compliance officer is fined, and in this case, the monetary penalty wasn't great. It's the fact that they're almost unemployable. Certainly, they can't go back to the original job they had. They can't go back to working for a regulated entity under the same regulator very easily. So I think in some respects, prosecutors need to think carefully about this sort of career limiting involvement of compliance officers. I don't know the full facts of the Wills case. I obviously know what the FCA made public. I know what Mr. Wills said to me, which may be something that the FCA would dispute. But these, I think, are very challenging cases, and you'd hope that prosecutors don't just jump on the compliance officer because he's the near guy rather than the right guy.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Here.
So, Mike, here's my concern with this case, that I saw perhaps the facts not quite as egregious as you or Matt, and it seemed to me that, and even if they were more egregious along the lines that you guys characterize them, I see this moving towards a standard of negligence. Now, I didn't see negligence here. I agree with Matt if there it was closer to gross negligence. But as we, being good lawyers, we have to always think about the slippery slope. And it may get us little bitty steps there, but it seems to me to be moving in a direction where a chief compliance officer could be held at least civilly liable for engaging in a negligent act, either in the design, creation, or implementation of a compliance program.
Well, I think you raise a very good point, because think about all the information that comes into a chief compliance officer. And assuming you have a robust sort of reporting system and information system, to me, making them accountable for everything that comes across their desk is really almost unrealistic, given the fact that they don't have, rarely do they have sufficient resources to do their job. And time and attention to do that. So I agree with you on that. We don't want to see a negligence standard because, frankly, we'll get prosecuted as compliance practitioners. There are a lot of things there's a lot of information that can, sort of go the other way. And if we're going to start saying negligence or, gross negligence and not, provide real meat to the standard of what gross negligence is. Like, for example, in the Hayter case, would you say that one of those three, sort of set of events would be sufficient to prosecute the person? I hope not. Because I think then you are going towards that. And you're right, there's a slippery slope here. And, this gets to, and not to break out another soapbox here, but it gets to another point that I feel is really important for the compliance profession is to try to start to define professional standards for what they do. And I know it's really hard to do that because compliance officers work in different ways in different organizations, but the profession has to come together and do something there, because I think that's the way that you can start to set out what a reasonable, sort of chief compliance officer can do in certain situations. And my last point on that, and then I'll defer to you guys, is I've seen too many situations in criminal investigations where the person who is first or second to get blamed is usually the general counsel or the chief compliance officer, because they touched or were near the information that was, relevant because something blew up from that. The way they handled the third party. They may have reviewed something in the process. And I've seen too many super, sort of senior executives and even board members, to save themselves, will start pointing the finger at the general counsel or the CCO, and say, look, it was their fault. So we've got to provide more protection for the profession itself in some way, or to promote that idea. And I think your slippery slope argument is part of that, but I just think we need to define more, what professional standards should apply and what are they really responsible for? They can't be responsible for the entire behavior of the company.
So, Mike, why don't we save Hoskins' discussion for another day and just go directly into rants? And you were about to start on one, so you just want to continue on that tack, Mike?
Well, I do have, it actually is one of my rants, that I do believe that the compliance profession has grown in such a way, and I don't want to see the momentum lost. And I think the compliance profession has to become, as I would say, more professional in terms of setting out standards for conduct. And I can't think of better people to do it than the compliance profession itself, because they're the ones who are helping people to think about ethics and compliance as well. So my rant is, let's, at the SCCE, the next meeting of the group, let's start to push this idea and get, we have great thinkers, all of you folks who are attending here, and get some ideas on paper and start to circulate them and get some professional standards in place. And I don't think it's that hard, I guess, but, if lawyers can do it, and we know how much lawyers abide by their professional standards, chief compliance officers can do it. So that's my rant.
Jay Rosen, you got a rant for us?
I'm looking forward to June 8th. I'll say that. That'll be my rant.
Okay. Fair enough. Jonathan Armstrong.
I think I've probably ranted enough. I wonder if I could have a wish that we could have better quality politicians on both sides of the Atlantic.
That definitely qualifies as a rant. And our resident left-wing Cambridgeite, Matt Kelly's always good for a rant. So what do you have for us today, Matt?
Well, yeah, so I have two, and I'm going to keep them brief. One is a rant, another one is just an interesting item for the compliance radar screen. But I did want to raise a point about climate change in this day after Donald Trump announced that the United States will withdraw from the Paris Agreement. That is interesting, and I think compliance officers will see plenty of consequences that will touch them, in that already several states have said that they're going to adopt Paris-level standards anyways. I could foresee other nations imposing carbon tariffs on corporations from the U.S., all sorts of complications, because as the U.S. abdicates setting some sort of a federal stance on climate change and how we would handle environmental regulation, then I think that others are going to try and fill the void. And really the most important thing that did happen this week was more the shareholders at ExxonMobil voting against the board's wishes to say, yes, Exxon, we really do want you to disclose much more about the impact of climate change on your business. So we're going to see more shareholder activists. We're going to see more local governments. We're going to see more foreign governments trying to fill the vacuum that the Trump administration has decided to create. So that's going to be, I think, something that will have many more implications than certainly Donald Trump understood, or even that we here today do understand. For compliance and corporate governance is going to be a whole lot of fun there. So that is my one rant. The other thing that I did want to call out just for the public consideration, I wanted to just raise the point about Hui Chen, the Justice Department's compliance counsel, who has started tweeting on social media and making some comments on LinkedIn in a very provocative way. I should say, foremost, I have never met Hui Chen personally. I do not know her, and I personally also agree with a fair number of the tweets she is saying. But her tweets are very, very thinly disguised shots at the ethical misconduct we are seeing flowing out of the Trump administration, specifically the Oval Office and the West Wing. Really rather unusual to see a sitting Justice Department employee make these kind of statements. They are very much in the spirit of good tone at the top and ethical conduct. So as a compliance professional, I agree with most of what she is saying, but I'm rather astonished that she'd have the nerve to go out and say it. I wonder if that means she's looking to raise her profile before she goes back to the private sector someday. I don't know, but she is worth following on Twitter because, wow, man, she throws some zingers out there.
Well, I should perhaps add, Matt, that I do know, and I'm sort of not surprised at the tone of the tweets knowing her, but I am surprised at the tone of the tweets given where she's sitting. I think she's a great character, a fun lunch companion, and the tweets certainly reflect that, don't they?
The compliance Twitterverse is much more rich and vibrant with having her in there. So I'm glad she's tweeting. It's just, they are worth reading if you're a compliance professional. I think she's at Chen Ethics on Twitter.
Well, gentlemen, as always, this has just been a ton of fun, and I look forward to continuing the roundtable discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.